Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. If you enjoyed our really huge episode of Peter Zeihan that came out earlier this week, you know that Sagar and I are really obsessed with this question and this topic of something's wrong in the country right now. Left, right, center, independent, Democrat, Republican. We all basically know this is true. The thing that we can't quite agree on is what exactly went wrong and what should we actually do about it. So in this genre, you've got Peter Zeihan talking about how supply chains are breaking down, the international system doesn't work anymore, we've given up on globalization, and you then have all the attendant problems. That's one answer. That was our Tuesday episode. For today's episode, I'm speaking with the author, Andrew Rice. He's written this really interesting book. It's called The Year That Broke America, and it is all about how he believes the year 2000 is actually the specific moment where politics and culture turned, and so many of the problems you see in the country today really came to a head. You've got third-party candidacies. You've got people arguing the Democrats and the Republicans are the same face of the same neoliberal coin. You have an issue with terrorism. You have debates over Cuban and immigration. And you also have the big, obvious topic of the dot-com bubble, which is going to be really resonant to folks in the tech industry right now. So many things are huge here. It's a really interesting conversation. Would love for you all to check out the book, but also check out all our other work on this broad topic, because the way we see it, this is all one big puzzle, and this is just one more small piece of putting it all together. So hope you enjoyed the episode. And by the way, we've just released our Supercast exclusive information. So episodes, exclusive interviews, bonuses. So if you'd like to check that out, go look in the show notes. Hope you enjoy this. Andrew Rice, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks.
I'm really excited to speak to you about your book for two reasons. Number one, the year 2000 was actually the year that I first got interested in politics. And by interested in politics, I mean my parents were watching the News Hour of Jim Lehrer. I asked who the two men on the stage were during dinner, and it was Al Gore and George W. Bush debating. So once again, these were particularly deep thoughts. It was just my actual interest and awareness. But then two, this is in a really interesting genre, which is this idea of, it's very clear in the year 2022 that something is off in America right now. And what you are positing is that the year of focusing on, that weird state we're in right now should really be the year 2000. So I want to start by asking you about the title, actually. It's The Year That Broke America. Can you define what a broken America is in your conception?
Well, I mean, I think that really a lot of the book is talking about the squandering of the good fortune of that millennium year. So you can look at it in a lot of different ways. I mean, one thing that a lot of it is about how maybe we didn't know how good we had it at that moment, and how lightly or carelessly we as Americans allowed that to slip away. So on the economic front, it was a time of amazing surpluses, trillions of dollars in budget surpluses that just sort of stretched as far as the eye could see. Politically, there was a sort of centrist consensus. A lot of the political debate in that 2000 election was about how to spend this amazing windfall that came out of the economic plenty of the late 1990s. Technologically, it was a time in which the internet was really just kind of coming into being. I think it was a time of a lot of technological optimism about how the idea that the internet would bring people together. And the book opens with the Millennium New Year of 2000, and President Clinton gives a speech in which he talks about how the technologists that he's been talking with about the millennium have been telling him predicting that the internet would bring an end to war and to miscommunications among people. There was a sort of a blithe idea that by allowing people to communicate more instantaneously and get to know each other better, that the world would kind of come together as one and realize that it's elements of commonality were even stronger than the ethnic and political and ideological differences that seem to divide them. And finally, on the geopolitical level, it was a time in which the U.S. geopolitical dominance was unquestioned, and economic dominance was unquestioned. I mean, in his 2000 State of the Union address, President Clinton gave a kind of unapologetic and unmitigated praise of celebration of globalization as the defining force of that era. And globalization, I think, has since become a kind of dirty word, both on the left and the right, for different reasons. Or actually, part of my book is about how the left and right actually, the marginal forces of the left and the marginal forces of the right at this time in particular had quite similar critiques of globalization, but they were sort of considered very far beyond the pale and marginal at that time. And now they've become central to our political discourse. The idea that the trade agreements struck during that time period were bad deals for the American people and American industry is something that you hear, former President Trump saying, is something that you hear the Democratic Socialists saying. So it's I think the idea that our present political moment, when we talk about, I think people from the left, people from the right, I think commonly agree that the polarization of our nation is that if our nation is broken, it's a function of this political polarization. Well, what I'm saying is that the roots of this political polarization and this cultural polarization, this time in which it seems as if we're constantly in turmoil and no one can talk to anyone about anything, the roots of this can trace back to this really profound turning point in 2000.
Yeah, so much I want to pick up there. So firstly, let's talk about the centrist political consensus, because you're telling a bunch of different stories in this book, but the story that kind of runs throughout it and that I feel appears the most just analytically, this was a terrible take. I think it was a bad take at the time, but every year since then, it's been the worst take ever, has been the idea that the Democrats and the Republicans were the same. This is basically the Ralph Nader argument. This is a lot of the argument that Pat Buchanan, so Ralph Nader is the Green Party candidate. Pat Buchanan is the Reform Party candidate. And very clearly, the second the year 2000 is over and you have a president, you obviously see, well, it turns out that Al Gore didn't want to use that, surplus for tax cuts. George W. Bush did want to use it for tax cuts. There's 9/11. Al Gore would have had a very different response than George W. Bush had. Maybe not in Afghanistan, but definitely when it comes to expanding the war into Iraq, given just the nature of people who came in and were attached to the George W. Bush administration. So can you just talk about what made people think, and maybe you think that there was something that was really deeply the same about the two parties, but I just think that was just, I think that was just an incredibly dumb take that really confused a lot of people about the actual choices they faced. Like, how do you think about this idea?
Well, I think it traces back to, as so many other things do, to Bill Clinton, and I think it traces back to a time period in the early 1990s when the Democratic Party came to a conclusion that the only way to win national elections at that time appeared to be to move to the center, to elide differences between the liberal and Republican, or liberal and conservative approaches to policy issues. So, the the catchphrase that was used for it during this time period was called triangulation. I think maybe Dick Morris came up with that, but the idea of kind of trying to pick this, the less tactical way of saying it, and probably the way that the Clintonian Democrats would prefer, is that they called it the third way. The left and the right, the idea that the left and the right were both discredited. So there was this third way that was, not just, this is not just an American phenomenon, but, you had Tony Blair in Britain doing much the same thing with the Labour Party, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany at this time. Now he's a much different figure in his standing in the political firmament, but at that time was considered to be a kind of Clintonian figure among the, social democrats in Germany. And there are many other people who fit into this mold of liberal, very, very, broadly speaking, progressive, liberal on social policies, more free market oriented on economic policy, and the party, the Democratic Party during this time period, I mean, almost pathologically during the Clinton era would sort of take Republican ideas, that had been developed at, Heritage or, Manhattan Institute or, other places like that, and would kind of moderate them and put them into more to democratic ears, more uplifting language, around similar ideas, and would market them to Democratic voters. And this proved to be very successful. In fact, so successful that in 2000, because of some, after losing a couple times to Bill Clinton, the George W. Bush and the Republican Party decided that they would try an approach that was much the same thing, coming from the right, taking what were taken to be liberal points of view, for instance, on immigration, coming up with approaches that were palatable to centrist Democratic voters, people who were living in the suburbs, people who are now voting in lockstep for the Democratic Party because of the subsequent realignment and political drift. But at this time, we're much more up for grabs as voters. And so you had George W. Bush running in 2000 saying, things like, love and compassion doesn't end at the Rio Grande and so on, things that would be anathema in the, I think it's fair to say, in the Republican Party of Donald Trump, and being rewarded for it. And I guess, so to say, so that's the historical roots of it. Now, and that I think, is, in my view, it looks pretty good in comparison to our current political state of polarization and endless fighting over every single issue and sort of complete inability for the legislative branch in particular to address important societal problems. Where I think you're right about it being a bad take is that, ultimately a kind of cynicism set in, an idea that politics is really only about character, only in characters that, I'm using it in the 1990s meaning, which is basically a catchphrase meaning like likability or relatability, over time,
not having sex scandals is
not
also
having
very
sex
direct.
scandals. Yes.
Well, because quick thing, because this is this is kind of your point. A huge part of the compassionate conservative George W. Bush triangulation was, hey, like we can be compassionate and centrist too. There just won't be any interns who are getting sexually harassed in the workplace. Like that's that is the direct use of character. Yeah. Basically, you could have the good parts of the 90s without the parts that we really didn't like on a couple of different levels.
Right, and I mean, and I think that that it was in part a function of, in times of plenty and in times in which there aren't foreign threats. I think the necessary first condition for all of this was the end of the Cold War and the lack of geopolitical threat to the United States that really it didn't seem like as if any of these contests between the parties, between candidates, were all that consequential. To be honest, it's hard to like think back now to this time, because we live in a time when it seems like every election, whether it's for president of the United States or for Secretary of State of Georgia or what have you, seems as if it has almost these sort of existential level stakes attached to it. The idea, there's an idea that it's not just policy that's up for grabs, but the very kind of fundamental tenets or of the nation that are at stake oftentimes in these elections. And it's hard to cast your mind back to a time in which politics didn't seem that important, or in which a sizable proportion of the American public felt as if either guy could be president and things would be more or less kind of continuing on the same path. This is one of the things that's the most jarring in the comparison between these two time periods is how could people be so complacent, and how could the American public actually think that the election of 2000 didn't matter? And the answer is that they didn't know why it would matter. They didn't know what was coming. And specifically, in my book, it's what's coming is represented by the 9/11 plot, which to talk a little bit about kind of like how the book is structured. The central kind of construct of this book is looking at the coincidence, the historical coincidence that the recount and the contested election in Florida that determined the presidency by the most smallest margin imaginable happened in the same time and place, and oftentimes in like the same airspace as the training stages of the 9/11 plot. So the people who are going to change the world, the people who are going to change this political construct and in my view break America, to bring us back to why I titled the book what I did, were right there, and they were witness to all this, and they were there living among us at that time. And to me, that's a really quite profound historical confluence that I wanted to explore deeper in the book.
Yeah, a million things I want to respond to with. One, I really resonate with your point about how it feels like the stakes. I think it's not just a feeling thing. The stakes are so high right now in the sense that, it matters who the Arizona legislature elects this year because of the certification of the Electoral College issue. So in 2000, you have this time where there's just like, well, unironically, who would I rather have a beer with question that would help determine whether or not people voted certain ways. Like my grandmother, rest in peace. Like she voted for George W. Bush as a 1990s Democrat because of the character issue to your point. And now we're at a time where there's a legitimate conversation about, okay, like what is Doug Mastriano, the Republican nominee for Pennsylvania? What is he going to do? What is the state legislator going to do in Arizona? It's really wild to see the stake and narrative shift there. But number two, I also appreciate how you helped me. I'm prone to overstatement. I've dialed back my criticism of people who thought the parties were too alike in the sense that, given the way you just told the story, when it came to the big questions of the late 1990s, there wasn't that much daylight by the 1998 midterms, right? In the sense of welfare needs to be reformed. The era of big government is over. Those were big 1990s questions. I think the issue was, and I think you captured this so well in the book, is that just like that, because of 9/11, frankly, that Ruiz expands outwards, the questions at hand shifted instantly, making the fact that the two parties were aligned on those 1998 questions just totally irrelevant. So the question in 2001 is no longer, hey, like, should we reduce the size of government now that the Cold War is over? It's no longer, hey, like, are we concerned that like the welfare system isn't quite in sync with the American nation's consensus now that we're kind of over the 1960s expansion of big government? That's the big question then. But I don't think everyone realized that the question to ask George W. Bush was not, are you going to continue with centrism? The question was going to be, let's say the US is attacked. Are you going to treat that as a police action? Are you going to treat it as a legal matter? As you point out, Janet Reno-Rui was approaching it as, or are you going to launch a global war on terror that's going to reshape the entire geopolitical system? So that's just like that's my dialed back version. It's that when folks thought the parties were the same, it's not that they were crazy. It's that they were kind of focused on the wrong questions. And it's actually kind of to the detriment of Al Gore as a candidate that he didn't focus the election on the right question. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And that's the completely fair summation of my point of view on this. I mean, in fairness to Al Gore and even in fairness to George W. Bush, I mean, it would have been impossible to have the conversation about terrorism and what an attack to America would mean in the late 1990s, because it just was so incredibly unimaginable, inconceivable. The attack of 9/11 and it's, this is a real generational thing too, because I think it's difficult for somebody who grew up largely in a post 9/11 context to really fully understand what a complete and utter blow that was to the conception of America's place in the world and everything, that flowed out of it. I mean, just as you say, instantaneously, everything kind of changed. I mean, the only thing that can be kind of I feel like in my, in my lifetime that really feels comparable in terms of just sort of fundamentally changing things, is Trump's election in 2016. But even then, I mean, there was time to, it was still shocking when it actually happened, but there was time to process the fact that it was, a possibility, albeit a difficult to comprehend one, I think, in the political context of 2015 and early 2016. Whereas 9/11 really just, kind of came out of nowhere. And as you say, everything changed instantaneously.
And quick thing I want to add to that, because what's so interesting here, and once again, this is how you tell the story. In the late 90s, there were these little hints of what was coming in terms of 9/11. So there are the bombings in East Africa. Al Qaeda kills hundreds of Kenyans, mostly like U.S. like embassy staff that were foreigners, a couple Americans. Bill Clinton launches missiles at a factory in Sudan. You have Osama bin Laden like declaring war on the U.S. as the USS Cole bombing in 2000. But they were just so small. They just weren't top of radar for basically anyone outside of the NatSec community. But the difference with 2016, I think, to your point, is not only did you have some time to process it, but I think there was probably a much clearer indication that things were off in the sense that, wait, it's 2014. Eric Cantor, the presumptive next Republican Speaker of the House, is taken out in a primary because he was too, let's say, centrist on the issue of immigration. Wait a second. The whole reason why he was going to the center on immigration was that the Republican Party thought in order to come back from the Romney loss that they needed to moderate in order to appeal more to Hispanic voters. So that's just like a quick narrative violation with the base and the party weren't lined up. You then have Brexit. You then have like Bernie Sanders challenging Hillary Clinton. There were just these quicker hints that just the status quo, Jeb Bush could be a nominee, Hillary Clinton could be a nominee thing. But with 9/11, there was nothing just so like punching you in the face in the same way.
Well, just to slightly, sort of nudge that in a little bit of a different direction, like those events, like the embassy bombings, the Cole attack, they were big deals. I mean, they were huge front page news. The threat of Al Qaeda was well known, but what the thing about that was so shocking about 9/11 was that, Al Qaeda was considered to be already considered to be the most serious national security problem that the Clinton administration was dealing with. I mean, Bill Clinton told George W. Bush that this was, during the transition, that this was going to be the most vexing problem he was going to have to deal with. But the 9/11 attacks were such an unimaginably huge escalation of their ability to attack and to actually strike buildings that were part of the skyline and destroy them. It was just, it was sort of like, it was taking the scale of these events and just escalating our understanding of what our vulnerabilities were to such an amazing degree. I mean, at the time, the idea was, the comparison was to Pearl Harbor or something like that. But nonetheless, I mean, Pearl Harbor was a snake attack, but it wasn't a surprise to anyone that the United States got pulled into the war. This was really like, I think no one understood that it was possible for the United States to be attacked on its own soil in this incredibly, sophisticated isn't the right word because it was a pretty low tech attack, but in this incredibly damaging, coordinated way that was and I think it gets back to like some of the cultural elements of the book. It was a televised spectacle. It was a spectacle that was created by people who understood how what we would now think of as a social media event or a viral event. They understood how to create a spectacle that would be indelible in the public mind, and they were fighting a different kind of war than we realized they were fighting.
I've got a good question from our producer, Aaron, on the side here. If you could say that the issue in today's politics, and people definitely feel this, is that there's too much polarization, could you argue that the issue in 2000 was there wasn't enough polarization in the sense that people didn't know the stakes enough? People weren't aware quite of what was actually up for grabs. Like, how would you think about this? Like, how polarized should or shouldn't people be?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a difference between, being aware of and taking seriously the policy and ideological differences between candidates and the incredibly vicious and vitriolic political rhetoric that we now see. I think that, you know, and part of it is, you know, do we, in a way, like in 2000 at this time, I mean, I remember as a journalist, actually, ironically, the voice of this point of view in my book is not ironically, but perhaps foreshadowing the future. The voice of this perspective in my book is Michael Wolff, who at the time was a media critic at New York Magazine, where I now work. I didn't work there at the time, but he, you know,
and why have people heard the name Michael Wolff the past 4 years?
Well, Michael Wolff is, the author of Fire and Fury and sort of the court chronicler of one of the many court chroniclers, but perhaps the most
entertaining. Let's just put it that way.
Court chronicler of the Trump administration. So Michael Wolff at this time was a media critic for New York Magazine and was writing constantly during the recount. Just to recap very quickly the history here, on election night, the election had been very boring up until election night, and then all of a sudden on election night, the whole thing comes down to Florida, comes down to a few thousand votes. There's a lot of excitement. It goes back and forth. There's different time periods in which different people think that they've won, and it finally resolves itself that nobody knows who won. And so a whole bunch of lawyers end up going to Florida to fight for the presidency. This is the sort of the concluding third of my book. And Michael Wolff, the cynical media critic for the New York Magazine at the time, says like, "Oh, this is great! Finally, something that's entertaining in politics." The other person who voices this point of view, Tucker Carlson, who probably needs no introduction, but he's gone on to be, the highest rated host on Fox News. At this time, he was actually considered to be a quite centrist, mainstream, albeit conservative, but sort of nice bow tie wearing intellectual conservative journalist who would write for New York magazines and so on. So in any case, both of these individuals are saying like, "Oh, this is sort of exciting. This is new. We haven't seen this before." And I think that I think that it's sort of like in this moment, all of a sudden that this feeling in which the rules, the normal rules and the normal guardrails of political combat have been taken off, and all of a sudden the two parties are fighting in a kind of battle that nobody really has seen before or knows how it will turn out. This was like a very sort of exciting moment for a lot of people in the press. And a lot of us, to get back to my point of like, is polarization good or bad? A lot of us, I think at the time were like, wow, this is pretty fun. This is different. We haven't seen something like this before. And now every election is kind of like this. Every election feels like it's a 50-50 election. Every election feels like, that. And the other thing that happened over the course of the recount, I should point out, is that the formerly seemingly small differences between the candidates became, at least vis-a-vis the partisans for each candidate, became much more vicious and much more it became this kind of fight to the death to determine who was going to hold the presidency. And this again is something that was exciting in the moment. Wow, we haven't seen this before. A real political battle in which in which ruthlessness is rewarded and no, and the mask of civility that the candidates sort of affect during the campaign is ripped off, and they're actually really going at each other in a real fight for power. All that seemed like kind of interesting and fun and different, and the kind of thing that people made movies about in the immediate aftermath and so on. But in retrospect, now it looks like a harbinger of the future. Every election's like that now. Every election feels like, not just that. Every election feels as if, each side feels that not only, it's not necessarily only to defeat the other side, but to kind of sow the fields with salt so that they can never run again. And so, what in the moment felt as if it was a kind of a fresh, new, exciting kind of, we're living in interesting times. Well, as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Another thing that comes to mind also is that, can you imagine, and this is just giving context, especially for the younger listeners who were not alive during this. Can you think of an election where an election is sleepier than Clinton versus Dole in 1996? I was doing a math. I'm like, in 20th century American politics, at least, I cannot think. Actually, let's just be fair and say post New Deal. Let's just keep it to that. That is just the sleepiest, least entertaining election that anyone could basically imagine at a core level there. Something that really comes to mind, I really appreciated your portraits of the main characters here on the politician side. And the thing that's going to be striking to any reader or listener is how young all the actual politicians are compared to the status quo. So, Bill Clinton,
the status quo, there's largely, a lot of them are the same people.
Exactly. That's like, yeah, it's like, there's that dynamic. So there's something to be said there, but, Bill Clinton's 46 when he's elected. Al Gore was 44, I believe, when he was selected as vice president. George W. Bush is around the same age as Bill Clinton. So he was like a young, very young 50s when he's selected. But now, obviously, our political system, like it or not, it feels like it's a crew of 70 somethings really fighting to the death as they really leave the stage.
And also sort of like the bottom of the barrel 70 somethings, right? Because the ones who are like actually, possibly good at being president have already had their chance. So now we're getting the Joe Bidens of the world. So, who tried many, many times.
So here's what I'm curious about. So two questions here. Question one, what was it about this baby boom 40-something generation that enabled them to step up and take political power for the next 30 years? And what is it about, let's just say, their compatriots in the Gen X cohort? I'm saying this as like a mid-stage millennial. Why did they miss that opportunity? Because once again, the 50-something, 40-something Democrats flamed out during the 2020 primary. Marco Rubio, and tried to do the young, I'm saying young in 21st century terms, tried to do the young next generation thing in the 2015 Republican primary. What explains just the real difference between the rising boomers of the 90s and just the Gen Xers in the 2010s and early 2020s?
I don't know, man. It's been torturing me my entire life.
I wasn't going to guess which cohort you're in, but if you want to out yourself and admit to your generational failure, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that is this isn't a new phenomenon, right? In the sense that the boomers felt like the greatest generation, the World War II generation, stuck around way too long, right? So you had basically, from Nixon onward, you had Kennedy onward, you had presidents that were all from that World War II generation all the way through George H.W. Bush. And so they felt like they waited an awful long time to get power. And I guess, that once they had it, that it was hard to dislodge. So part of it, I think, it just comes down to sheer numbers. There are fewer Gen Xers than there are boomers. But I think some of it, I have to say, I'm just thinking aloud now, but some of it may have to do with the fact that politics didn't necessarily seem like a high calling, right, in this time period in the 1990s and 2000s. it wasn't necessarily drawing in, because the stakes seemed relatively low. Maybe it wasn't necessarily drawing in the people who it might normally into public service. If you were in the year 2000, if you wanted to change the world, like you didn't run for the House, you'd like started a internet startup. So the people who I think of as the most profound cultural forces out of that Gen X generation, they have had really profound influences on politics and the culture, but they've done it through non-political means, or non-explicitly non-electoral political means. So you've got, we have a lot of we may not have a lot of power, but we have a lot of we have a lot of money, and or at least we have a lot of control over the political discourse. I guess I'd say, in the sense of having invented these platforms in which a lot of our political discourse, for better or worse, happens now.
No, that's actually a really astute point, because I'm sure there's this broad Gen X field politics take, but now that I'm thinking about it, in every other category you can imagine, film, television, culture, technology, Gen Xers were incredibly accomplished, but somewhat to your point, it's also just and this is where this comes down to, sometimes you're just born at the wrong time. Maybe the time to this is good. If you're in Gen X, it's a great time if you want to become a billionaire. If you want to be a 22-year-old, and look at Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, talk about someone who's had a huge impact on our political system. Peter Thiel is on Stanford's campus during the dot-com boom, and then becomes a billionaire and invests in Facebook. Great time to be that person. Would love to be at Palo Alto in the late 90s. Not a great time if you wanted to be a transformative politician in the political system.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, this was very much in the culture. It's not it's not an accident that this happened. I mean, the idea that politics is not that Washington or politics is not someplace that you went if you really wanted to affect transformative change, that was communicated from the top on down. I mean, the idea, the era of big government is over, as you said. Probably one of the most famous Bill Clinton lines. The era of big government, also meant. I mean, big government meant big sclerotic, bureaucratic government, but it also sort of meant the era of ambitious government was over. The idea that all Clintonianism and what George W. Bush ran on were these ideas that that you would nudge things incrementally in one direction or another, but that the American public didn't desire transformative change from their government. Well, so if you're a 25-year-old at that time, and thinking about how am I going to make transformative change, and your president and presidential candidates are saying don't look to Washington for it. Maybe you go, I think there are a lot of people out in Palo Alto who are saying yeah, we love transformative change. And in fact, we're doing it right now, and you can do it right this second, in your garage. To use the cliche. I mean, so I think that I think that you're this idea that Gen X has failed is not necessarily. I mean, it succeeded on the terms that were set out at the time that my generation started its progression through life. And what we were told was that if you wanted to make change in the world, it was unlikely that the government was going to bring it to you. And there was also a complacency. I mean, to go back to the idea of the year that broke America, right? There's also complacency to it. There was a sense that American ideas and the underpinnings of American, the American democratic idea were so powerful that they would just triumph on their own. That we had witnessed in the late 1980s the complete fall for no particular reason that that you could see. Like there was no communism.
You didn't see, to your point about like the internet changing things. You did not see the Soviet system break down in real time as you would today. You just wake up one day, I'm sure, and you're like, wait a second, like, wait, the republics are breaking up, the Berlin Wall is down. I'm sure that just felt, talk about like an instantaneous reaction thing.
Yeah, and so there's an idea that it wasn't that American these American democratic ideas and the globalist economic policy and so on, that these were unchallenged and unchallengeable ideas that would just sort of triumph on their own. And so, like, why, if you're a young person, like, why would you run for office to advance them? They're doing fine. They triumphed over the communist system without even firing a shot. And our enemies,
wanted to be more like us. They want, Gorbachev's in the Pizza Hut ad, which is still crazy. If people want to fund YouTube, search Gorbachev Pizza Hut. Like you're the literal former head of the Soviet Union is hawking, mediocre 1990s pizza capitalism, right? Like that's, if you want to see what the end of history looks like, it's probably that video. Just a reflection, then like a final big question before we hit the hour. What I think is so depressing about what you're saying is that your articulation of, you were told generationally that if you want to make a difference, go somewhere else. What's depressing about that is I think that's an accurate summation of like the current system today. In the sense that, like, if you wake up every day and you're driven by a need to like systematically change, or like beyond just like obvious technocratic things, like reimagine the American political system and political life and this or that, like I do not think getting elected to the current Congress is going to actually help you. I think the difference is there's still, that opportunity still existed in the 1990s. And because of just this complacency, people acted as if that wasn't there. So I think it's this weird feeling of this message was probably transmitted and imbibed at the wrong moment. And now it's actually just accurate. But the question is, like, was that always inevitable, or is that just a combination of these things? What I want to close with then is your most like news you can use aspect for people, because this comes through your articulation of the problem the Democrats faced in the 1990s. So all indications are that Democrats are going to get totally wrecked, to be really technical about it, in 2022, despite coming into office with all this ambition and all this hope. This is Bill Clinton in 1992 when he defeats George H.W. Bush. Joe Biden had a similar opportunity or dynamic. And what Bill Clinton chose to do was, Bill Clinton, to your point, chose triangulation. Bill Clinton said, look, this is a center-right country. JFK is my hero, but I'm not JFK. I am going to reconcile as much of the right with left goals as possible, and basically just give up on ambitious projects. Hillary Care was not the right call. Joe Biden's going to face a similar choice going into 2023 when it comes to his presidency. I think it's very easy in retrospect to critique Clintonian triangulation and centrism as like unambitious and neoliberal, but I think usually those critiques understate the real political disaster that he was facing if he didn't make those moves. So with that in mind, like what do you think that story means for Joe Biden now that he's in a similar dynamic that Bill Clinton was?
Well, I think unfortunately for Joe Biden, Biden's has a much more difficult situation, which is to say, triangulation between Newt Gingrich Republicanism and Bill Clinton Democratic, Democratic Leadership Council, centrist Democrat ideology. As much as much as it seemed like a kind of revolution, to use Gingrich's own terminology, in 1994 when they took power, it was possible to foresee a way in which the Democratic Party or a Democratic president could take some of these ideas like reforming welfare, or to take one that looks less good in retrospect, getting tough on crime, 3 strikes and you're out, these sorts of things that I think in retrospect, a lot of people from the right and left have come to the conclusion were poorly thought out policies. But at the time, they were quite popular, and they were areas in which the Republicans and Democrats could find like a place to meet in the middle. It's going to be. I mean, I just don't. I don't foresee a scenario in which, a Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, with like a very emboldened Freedom Caucus, and a Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell with a very emboldened group of senators led by Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and others, are gonna have places in which they can meet Joe Biden on policy, in part because our current system, the divisions in our current system, to me seem less policy based than they are cultural. There's been this realignment within the parties. I mean, I think the big story over the course of the last decade or more has been the sort of realignment of the parties, partly along geographic lines, but also along class and education lines. You now have a Democratic Party that has lost touch with huge swaths of the working class that it used to speak to and used to rely on, union voters in the Northeast and the Midwest. And similarly, you have a Republican Party that, may well have permanently alienated a lot of suburban voters, especially women in the suburbs who, formerly would have voted Republican on economic or other social cultural issues, but are probably lost forever because of the tone of the Republican Party on a lot of these cultural issues and frankly things like Roe v. Wade. So you've had this like realignment where the two parties not only they don't disagree so much ideologically, although they do disagree on ideology, but they're actually really culturally opposed to one another in a way that it's not a matter of finding common ground on some legislation where you split the difference between the two parties. It's really a matter of, I don't want you to win because if you win, I lose, or I feel as if my tribe is losing face vis-a-vis yours, and ultimately the goal is for my tribe to keep control of the government. So this is this is something that starts in 2000. I mean, part of what I write about in this book is about how these cultural currents that would lead to our current cultural and political polarization were just starting to happen at the time. But it's going to be it's really tough to see how President Biden would find a third way. I suspect that after, if, as I think you correctly predict, that there's a major defeat for the Democrats in 2022, I suspect that there will be quite strong pressure on Biden not to run again. And it's possible that this next election looks more like 1968 than it looks like 1996. Unfortunately for the Democrats, I just think that clearly the President Biden was elected really to do one thing. He accomplished it the day that he took the oath of office, and after that, the Democratic Party has sort of didn't really know what to do next, and I think they're still looking for somebody who can compellingly tell the American public like what it is that they want to do besides not be Donald Trump.
Yeah, and just to close, because I want to respond to, I think, your useful bit at the start here. The flaw with analogizing 1995 after the Republican midterm win to today, to your point, is the questions that the political system was engaging on were ones where triangulation was an option. So the question isn't, do we have welfare in this country or do we not have welfare? The question was, okay, like, what should it look like? How long can you get welfare? Does it expire? Should we rename the title? Like those questions are ones that could be triangulated. Questions of, is it too easy to vote in this country, or is it not easy enough to vote? Or is it not, or is it like not easy? Is it too hard to vote in this country? Those ones do not have this, like, triangulation doesn't work because it's just very binary. And let's just say that, when you're adding non-binary questions to cultural polarization and a disastrous economy, it's hard to see, you're not going to be able to slick Willie Bill Clinton your way out of that one. So I think that's a great way to close it. Like, once again, like, Andrew, really enjoyed speaking with you. We've kept this conversation very meta, but I think in each of the different stories you're telling in the book, I think the broader vibe we're discussing here really comes out. So I can't recommend it enough.
All right. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you. Great conversation.